Harold for leading us through the wilderness for a bit. If you think that's long, the Israelites were out there for 40 years. When I started this series, I expressed some hesitation about engaging this well-worn metaphor of the chrysalis and the butterfly for 8 weeks. And I've come to find out that I needn't have worried about that at all, because some of you are just real butterfly freaks. I've heard all kind of stories over the past few weeks about your experience with butterflies, and I've learned things that I didn't know about butterflies before. There's something, isn't there, that just draws us to them. Their beauty in the mystery of the chrysalis. And so last week we talked and we saw about how once the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis, that it has to just sit for a little bit or hang on as its wings dry and it begins to unfold. But at some point, the butterfly needs to get on its way because it doesn't have a whole lot of time. The monarch butterfly, for example, only has, 3 out of 4 generations. We'll talk about that in a moment. But 3 out of 4 generations only have 2 to 6 weeks to live. There isn't a whole lot of time to be fooling around. Well, actually, there is time to be fooling around because that's what they're doing. But that's the only time they have is to reproduce so the next generation can emerge. And it's so easy, isn't it? Can we turn the gain down a little bit on this microphone? I hear some ringing. It's so hard to be getting on our way, isn't it? When there is so much that we oftentimes want to hold on to. That's the story that we find in the Exodus. As the people of Israel were making their way out of captivity into Egypt, into the wilderness, on their way to the promised land, and it took them about 40 years to do that, in an area about the size of New Jersey. It took them a while to get there. And as you can imagine, I know if I had been in the same situation, I would be complaining a little bit as well. And we always say, oh my goodness, look at those complainers. But there was some fruit to the complaining. Did you notice that? So it was by their complaining that we're told in the passage that God heard their complaining. Their complaining got them the provision of food. Their complaining drew them together as Aaron began to speak to them. They are addressed for the first time not as just this wandering group of nomads out in the wilderness, but they're addressed as the congregation. This spiritual community that is being together and working together. And their complaining also resulted in them coming face to face with the glory of God, the majestic mystery that Bruce was just singing about. The wandering in the wilderness was a necessary part of their journey and a necessary lesson for our journey. It's okay to complain a little bit. Might even be necessary to complain a little bit. But we also need to be getting on our way to fulfilling the call that God has placed on our lives, both individually and together. The nature of the complaint is interesting. So they find themselves out in the wilderness, and they find themselves recalling their lives in Egypt. And I think their memory of those times seems to be clouded a little bit. They're saying, okay, now we're out here, but when we were back in Egypt, we had these flesh pots, which is a kind of a strange translation. I like this translation better, these pots of meat. What Eugene Peterson, in his paraphrase of the Message, called lamb stew, that we just had with us, that we could eat whenever we wanted, and we ate our fill of meat and ate our fill of bread. One only needs to flip back a few pages to realize that that wasn't the whole story of their experience in Egypt. To go back to Exodus 5, which is kind of the climax of just the horrors that they endured at the hands of Pharaoh. They were making bricks, and then all of a sudden Pharaoh says, tell them that we're not going to give them the straw to make bricks anymore. They have to find their own straw and still produce their quota for the day of bricks. Just the incredible oppression that they worked under and lived under, which caused them to cry out to God, and God heard their cries and raised up Moses to lead them out of their oppression, to lead them out of the horror, to lead them out of Egypt. But in that process of moving forward, they couldn't just quite let go of what it was that they left behind. If you had that experience in life, have we had that experience of life as we do life together? I think there's all kinds of things that we need to let go of, that we're called to let go of as we move forward in our lives. A lot of times it's fear, like we just talked about. A lot of times it's pride. A lot of times it's an understanding of who we are that needs to change so that we can encounter God in ourselves and others in new ways. I think one of the things that the people of Israel had to let go of is their nostalgia for the past. Nostalgia is a difficult thing, isn't it? It makes us feel good, but oftentimes it keeps us from moving forward. It's really easy to get ourselves stuck in it. Thinking about the way things were, whether we're thinking about those things and remembering them accurately or not. But we always hearken back to the good old days, don't we? I kind of had that experience. Trish and I were at the exhibit. There's an exhibit at the Norton. I don't know if it's still there. Lovely exhibit on modernism. And there was a description of kind of the history of that and how that took place. And it talks about a period in our history where everything just looked bright and people were excited and technology was happening and the future just looked like it had no end. And I started wondering about that. What happened to that? Why don't we have that anymore? I was nostalgic for this period of history. And as I talked about that with people, I was reminded that, that wasn't a great time for everyone. It wasn't a great time for people of color. It wasn't a great time for women. It wasn't a great time for those that were being crushed under the new industry and the requirements of labor and work. Sometimes what we remember isn't as great as we remember it. But whether it was or whether it wasn't, we need to loosen our grip on that in order to move forward. Had that experience as we've sold this campus, and I've talked to folks. The people that had the most difficult time with selling our campus are the folks that we haven't seen around here in a few years. but that were very upset that the campus was sold, very upset that they had lost that connection to a memory of a certain period of their life. It's difficult. And we so often need to loosen our grip in order to move forward. So often we need to loosen our grip on ways of thinking. See, the children of Israel who were under oppression in Egypt, at least they were doing something that they were familiar with. It was horrible. Their children were killed. But at least there was a rhythm and a pattern that they were able to engage. Brian McLaren, who actually wrote that song, Majestic Mystery, talks about the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. And he talks about the plagues as being important for getting the people of Israel out of Egypt. And then he said the 40 years after that was about getting Egypt out of the people of Israel. But there was still that need for them to get out of that slavery mindset and to come to an understanding of the abundance of God. That God provides, that there always is enough. Interesting little play on words in this in Exodus 5, where it's being talked about how the people of Israel need to produce their quota for a day. The same word is used in Exodus 16 that Harold just read for us about the enoughness of the manna. There was always enough. Whether someone gained a little or gained a lot, there was always enough. If it was kept over for the next day, it was spoiled. Trying to get this idea of scarcity out of the minds and the hearts of the people of Israel, that God provides enough. And there's a couple of ways into that, which is helpful for places where we are in our understanding. Did God miraculously provide this manna and this quail? Maybe God did. There are other scholars that say that this manna-like substance was something that was oftentimes produced in the wilderness, and that migratory patterns and winds could have blown the quails into the place where the children of Israel were. No matter what way we look at that, there was provision. There was enough. So hard for us to get out of this scarcity mindset that we need to hoard and hold on. What would it take for us to be invited into a new way of understanding that God provides? What would it take for us to enter into this economy of the manna? That there is enough. What is it that there is not enough for us now? We look at the world and we're discouraged. There seems to be not enough civility, that seems to be sure. Not enough peace, not enough kindness. What if the civility and the peace and the kindness is there? We just need to do a little bit better job of looking for it and practicing it ourselves. One of the things that I experience the scarcity of is time. There just doesn't seem to be enough time to get everything we want to get done. And yet time is a lot like manna, isn't it? We get enough time for the day. I can't take any extra time from today and put it on to tomorrow. I can't go back to the past and pick out those moments of times that Facebook shows me the pictures of me with my 7-year-old son now that he's graduated and get those back somehow. We get the time that we get to accomplish what we need. 3 out of 4 generations of monarch butterflies live 2 to 6 weeks. The 4th generation lives for 9 months. Because that's the generation that has to get the monarchs from one place to another. in their migratory pattern. The monarchs get the time that they need to accomplish what they need to accomplish. We, and I, because I'm preaching to myself a little bit here, get the time that we need each day to accomplish what we need to accomplish. How am I going to use that? Am I going to use that time complaining about the way things I think should be? Am I going to spend that time in nostalgia about the way things were, or at least I perceive them to be? Or am I going to take that time and move forward into the uncertainty, into the mystery, into the presence of God, God's self, as He leads me, as He leads you, as He leads us into new ways of being, new ways of acting, new ways of thinking, new ways of serving the world. Let's pray together.